Aujourd'hui, je vais parler de sequence of return risk, especially in a volatile market like we have now. And obviously, this is with regards to our fire dreams, not just in and of itself. Hey, XenPuck here. Now, having read a lot about fire and just scrolling through the generic questions in fire groups and so on, I hear a lot of unnecessary fears, right, about market volatility or silly things like dollar cost averaging and inflation's effect on fire, yada, 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 right? But there is one particular topic that I do think poses a real risk to our fire dreams, and that is a sequence of return risk. Okay, so we're going to talk about that today. Oh, and please subscribe, comment, like, share, all that social media nonsense. Not sure why I keep saying this, I don't know. Because other people do it, so I'm just following. Boring. Do what you wish, because you're much kinder than me, I'm sure of it. I'll be great regardless, okay? So first, a quick definition. I'll link an article below from Forbes that shows the math part of it, but I'll summarize the article quickly, right? So basically, a sequence of return risk. We compare two timelines where at the end of it, the stock market returns are exactly the same. The only difference is whether there are losses earlier in the timeline versus later in the timeline. How this affects people in retirement, as there is a real impact, right? Basically, if you retired almost immediately, the stock market crashes, your financial situations will be much worse at the end of the same time period, right? Than if your initial years of return coincided with the increases in market returns, right? The reason for this is really easy to understand, right? Prior to retirement, a down market year just means more time to buy cheaper stocks generally, because you're still putting money into the market, right? And can actually work out as a positive if one has the mental fortitude to stay in while things look bad, right? But post-retirement, most people's expenses are fixed, so they have to take out at least the same amount of cash. But doing so is doubly bad during a downturn, right? One, you have to sell more shares for the same fixed cost. And two, whatever you take out theoretically cannot be replaced because you no longer have a income from a job, right? So the point of these studies really simple. If you have a fixed cost to living as most do, one of the easiest ways to run out of money is to be unlucky and have a few bad down years right at the beginning of your retirement. Now let's be clear, statistically this is actually relatively likely in terms of having a few in a row. That's bad, right? Because even though the stock market over the long run has averaged somewhere between 7 to 11% depending on how you want to count inflation, as a whole, that's over a long period of time. But if you look at year by year sample sizes, volatility is actually really high, and rarely is the gain right in the 7 to 10 to 11% range. Instead, we have lots of years where it either jumps by 15% or more or drops just as drastically, making a few years of consecutive drops not at all unimaginable. Okay, so point number two. Now that we've defined the problem, why did this particular topic spring to mind? Oh, it's because I saw someone in the fire group panicking because we just had a few days worth of drops in the market, right? Maybe a whole week's worth of it. And the paper's calling it, this has been in April of 2022, right? The biggest month of drops since March of 2020, that happened because it was immediately after most of the Western world decided to shut down and hide from the then new COVID situation, right? I find the comparison to be somewhat amusing because you know what happened after the steep drop of March 2020? It recovered almost immediately about 2 or 3 months later, okay? Now, when I check my personal net worth for the year of 2020, right, when that last, I think it dropped by like 10, 12% in March 2020, I ended the year up 18%. Okay, in 2020. And frankly, I don't even think I hit the market average, right? Because I didn't have all my assets in the stock market, right? So if I didn't freak out about the situation despite a once-in-a-century pandemic, why would I freak out now? Now, to be fair, the situation right now is also a little different, right? Countries' responses to COVID has really diverged, with China holding onto that zero COVID policy doesn't seem really sustainable, not to mention the whole European war thing that looked like it has the potential to go into a global-wide conflict. So yeah, okay, I can see why some people might worry. But my advice is simple, right? Maybe don't retire this instant, but also just to hold on to your hats, because all you have to do to wait out the short-term volatility is to just, hang on for a little bit, right? And if recent trends hold, maybe it'll recover to even before the year is over, right? Remember, when I talk about sequence of returns risks, it's really only a problem if you have pretty severe drops for a few years in a row. Both of those things has to happen, right? So an even year, even if there's no gain, is not a drop, okay? I'd only worry if your year ones are already looking like a steep drop and you don't know what the next year is going to happen, right? After all, otherwise I would trust long-term planning, right? Over even a real killer-like scenario like right now, right? Because relatively speaking, the sequence of return risk is just not very likely, especially given recent evidence, right? Now, finally, I like to point out two things that I think all of us who are interested in FIRE can do to prepare to mitigate sequence of return risk, right? You know, first piece of advice, really simple, right? Just build up a bigger cushion, right? Instead of aiming for 25x, aka following the 4% rule, aim for 33x of your annual spending, which would be a 3% rule, right? Now, I get the issue with this suggestion is that the difference between the amount of investable asset is actually quite significantly different between 25x you're spending to 33x you're spending, right? And this also depends on how much you really need to get out of your line of work, right? I know some people who just can't wait to stop working, and the idea of doing so for a year or two or more seems like a pain in the butt, right? Part two is even simpler. That's the real issue with how these statistical, theoretical sequence of return risk type of scenarios, the assumption is that we're always using the same amount of cost every year, right? Not taking into account how human beings are actually relatively adaptable. So I'd suggest if you see, inflation is rampant, there may be a bigger war coming, then switch to that wartime economic mindset before the government forces you to, because modern wars these days, they don't last like decades, okay? So toughen up and reduce your cost to the bare minimum. What you're really trying to do is minimize the amount of stocks that you have to sell, if possible, when the markets are down, therefore giving your equities time to recover, right? After all, even if you're not buying anymore, by the way. If you're already retired, you'd have more flexibility to do and spend things as you will, right? More so than the average office drone. Obviously, we don't always want to skimp and save still, especially during retirement. That's not fun, right? I get it. But look, if you get unlucky, all you need to do is ride out the usually a handful at most bad market years, right? And then you can be flush when the market is flush, right? It's good practice to practice on how you build your resiliency anyway, your financial resiliency I'm talking about. So, in conclusion, right, do I think sequence of return risk is a real problem for early retirees especially? Absolutely it is, right? More so than things like effects of inflation, more so than whether dividend stocks are better than growth stocks, and all those other kind of silly questions that I see. But it's still not enough for me to say this is an unworkable problem. Obviously, none of us wants to, be unlucky like that. So follow my simple steps of either cushioning for much more spend than you need, or being able to reduce down to bare basic type of living, at least for a handful of down years in a row at the beginning of retirement, if you're that unlucky. The reality is that people who can achieve even a semblance of FIRE level of savings are go-getters to begin with, so I have no doubt that both of these can be done when it really needs to be, right? Honestly, an even easier version is just to delay your retirement until the worst market downturn is over. But that's hard to time. You get that? Yes, so luck is one of those factors that cannot be understood, but do what I say and you have a reasonably chance to get it right. Or not, I can only tell you what has worked for me. Cheers, à la prochaine.